In the middle of World War II, the Atlantic Ocean had become a deadly gap. Convoys carrying food, fuel, and weapons from North America to Britain had to cross thousands of kilometers of open water. And in that empty stretch, they were almost completely defenseless. German submarines knew it. Night after night, ships disappeared beneath the waves. The obvious solution was air cover. Aircraft could spot submarines long before they attacked. The problem was simple. Planeskohulanti reached the middle of the ocean. There were no islands, no air bases, and not enough aircraft carriers to protect every convoy. Then someone proposed a solution so strange, so impractical, that at first it sounded less like a military strategy and more like a joke. What if they built a giant aircraft carrier out of ice? By 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic had turned into a brutal game of endurance. Every convoy sailing toward Britain carried something essential: food for civilians, fuel for factories, ammunition for the war effort. Without those shipments, the country couldn't survive for long, and German U-boats were waiting. Submarines could hide beneath the surface for hours, sometimes days, watching shipping lanes like silent predators. When the moment was right, they surfaced just long enough to fire their torpedoes. Often, by the time anyone realized what had happened, a ship was already sinking. Escorting destroyers helped, but they couldn't see very far across the ocean. Aircraft, on the other hand, could patrol huge areas and force submarines to stay underwater. But planes had a hard limit: fuel. Once they reached the middle of the Atlantic, they simply couldn't go any farther. That empty stretch of ocean became known as the Mid-Atlantic Gap. And as long as that gap existed, the submarines owned it. In 1942, a British inventor named Geoffrey Pike walked into a meeting with an idea that sounded completely out of place in the middle of a global war. Instead of building more steel aircraft carriers, which were expensive, slow to produce, and constantly targeted by submarines, Pike proposed something radically different. What if they built a carrier that submarines couldn't easily sink, because it wasn't made of steel at all? His idea was to construct a massive floating airbase out of ice. Not a thin layer, not a temporary platform, but an enormous structure, hundreds of meters long, thick enough to survive torpedoes, and large enough to launch aircraft in the middle of the Atlantic. At first, the proposal sounded ridiculous. Ice melts, ice cracks. Ice certainly doesn't survive explosions. Most people in the room assumed the idea would disappear as quickly as it appeared. But Pike insisted they were thinking about ice the wrong way, because the material he had in mind wasn't ordinary ice at all. Normally, an idea like that would have ended right there. But the situation in the Atlantic was becoming desperate, and desperation has a strange effect on decision-making. When the usual solutions stop working, even the strangest ideas start sounding worth a closer look. So instead of dismissing the proposal outright, the concept was quietly passed up the chain of command. Eventually, it reached one of the most powerful wartime leaders in Britain, Winston Churchill. Churchill had a reputation for encouraging unconventional thinking, especially when the stakes were high. And the idea of a nearly unsinkable floating airbase, one that could close the dangerous Mid-Atlantic Gap, was at least intriguing. He didn't approve building the giant structure immediately, but he did approve something else. A simple test. If this strange new material could prove itself, the absurd idea might suddenly become a very serious plan. Before anyone committed to building a floating mountain of ice in the middle of the Atlantic, the idea had to survive a simple question: would the material actually work? Engineers began experimenting with this strange mixture. Ice reinforced with wood pulp. When it froze, the result looked ordinary at first. Glansbot. It behaved very differently. The material was tougher, slower to melt, and surprisingly resistant to cracking. They called it Pikecrete, named after Geoffrey Pike. To prove it wasn't a just theory, a prototype block was prepared for demonstration. During a meeting with military officials, one of them decided to test it in the most direct way possible. He pulled out a pistol and fired at the frozen block. The bullet didn't shatter it. In fact, the shot reportedly ricocheted. If you enjoy real stories that sound completely impossible but actually happened, this is exactly the kind of moment history hides in plain sight. Because after that demonstration, the ridiculous plan suddenly started looking a lot more serious. With the early tests looking surprisingly promising, the project quietly moved forward. The code name was Project Habakkuk. and on paper, it sounded almost unbelievable. The proposed ship wouldn't be just large, it would be colossal, nearly 600 meters long, with walls of reinforced ice thick enough to absorb torpedo impacts. Runways would stretch across the top, allowing aircraft to patrol the vast empty stretch of the Atlantic. But the deeper engineers looked into it, the stranger the challenges became. Ice melts. Slowly, yes, but inevitably. To keep the structure stable, the ship would need an internal refrigeration system running constantly, circulating cold air through miles of pipes. Massive insulation layers would have to be built into the walls. Even steering such a gigantic block across the ocean raised serious questions. What had started as a clever idea was turning into something that bordered on engineering madness. And yet, despite all of that, they decided to build a real prototype. To see whether the idea could survive outside the lab, engineers built a small working prototype in a quiet lake in Canada. It wasn't the massive carrier imagined in the plans, but it was large enough to answer the real question. Could this strange material actually survive in the real world? The structure floated there through the seasons, exposed to wind, water, and sunlight. Under normal conditions, a block of ice that size should have melted away surprisingly fast. But something unexpected happened. The mixture of ice and wood pulpicrete melted incredibly slowly. The fibers inside the material acted like a kind of internal skeleton, holding everything together even as the outer layers softened. It didn't crack like normal ice. It didn't collapse, the way engineers feared. In fact, the prototype remained floating far longer than anyone predicted. Suddenly, the impossible part of the project didn't look so impossible anymore. As tests continued, the scale of the idea started to feel less like fantasy and more like a genuine engineering project. Design teams began drafting the full version of the vessel under Project Habakkuk. The numbers were staggering. The proposed ship would displace more mass than most warships ever built, with walls of reinforced ice thick enough to shrug off torpedo damage. Inside, the structure would contain an entire cooling system pipes, circulating refrigerated air to keep the massive body frozen even in warmer waters. Steel reinforcements, insulation layers, and internal corridors would turn the frozen structure into something closer to a floating fortress than a simple platform. Aircraft could land, refuel, and take off again, patrolling the exact part of the ocean where submarines had been operating almost freely. For the first time, military planners began to picture it clearly. A gigantic, nearly unsinkable airbase drifting in the middle of the Atlantic. And technically speaking, it could work. Despite the promising tests, reality slowly caught up with Project. As engineers refined the design, the numbers became harder to ignore. Building the full-scale structure would require enormous amounts of wood pulp, steel reinforcement, refrigeration equipment, and energy to keep the entire mass frozen. What had started as a clever workaround was beginning to look almost as complex as building several traditional aircraft carriers. At the same time, the war itself was changing. New long-range aircraft were entering service, capable of flying much farther across the Atlantic. Escort carriers, smaller, faster to build, and made with conventional materials also began joining convoys. Slowly, the dangerous mid-Atlantic gap started to disappear. The original problem the project was meant to solve was being solved by other means. And once that happened, the giant ice carrier no longer seemed necessary. The plan that once looked absurd and then briefly looked brilliant quietly faded away. In the end, the giant ice carrier was never built. Project Habakkuk slowly disappeared as the war evolved and more practical solutions took its place. Long-range aircraft began covering the Atlantic. Escort carriers joined convoys, and the deadly gap in the ocean gradually closed. But the idea itself never stopped fascinating historians, because for a brief moment during World War II, one of the most powerful governments on Earth seriously studied the possibility of building a warship out of frozen water and wood pulp. And the strangest part is this: it wasn't dismissed because it was impossible. Engineers proved the material worked. The prototype floated for months. The physics checked out. The project ended for a much simpler reason. History moved on. But the plan remains one of those rare moments where, in the middle of a global war, someone proposed something that sounded completely ridiculous. And the most surprising part is that it might actually have worked.